This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, and Super Inframan. If you'd like to help support the show, you can do so at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have back with me Mr. Lyle Blackburn. Hi, Lyle.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And you have a brand new book called Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire.
That's right. I say 10 years in the making, a lifetime of legends.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed you have a lot of stuff in here that you've just, places you've gone over the years that you're recounting and investigating now.
Right. Yeah, it was one of these that I kind of thought of this book a while back, and I did some, I've been to various swamps and things, and even when I did my Lizard Man book, that was kind of something that was originally supposed to be in this, but I realized that the scope of this was large to cover a lot of ground, a lot of swamps around North America. So I just kind of let this book develop over time, just, as reports came in, or I could go to swampy areas or do some research. So it kind of worked out for the best because it really kind of, rounds out every chapter, every swamp with just as much history and information as possible.
And you talk in here that you kind of have an affinity for swamps. Why swamps?
Well, I don't know. I think it's the same, affinity that I have for monster movies and cryptids. It's just something that was always there, and just something that I just have a good feeling, when I see a swamp, and I think I have good feelings when I see spooky things. It's just something I've always had. So, when I can remember watching movies when I was young, black and white movies, or dinosaur movies, Tarzan movies, horror movies, and anytime they had a swamp, I just thought, ooh, it looks so mysterious and cool. And any Scooby-Doo episode, even if it was a haunted house, it was always right next door to a swamp, and and so I don't know, it just always fascinated me, just the kind of ambiance and atmosphere of a swamp. And then as an adult and kind of in this research of cryptids and paranormal stuff, I learned of like all these real life reports and legends and things that are always associated with swamps. So it's like, oh yeah, it's just sort of my childhood fascination just sort of fleshed out in my adult writing form.
And how much of these reports do you think are generated because of the creepiness of swamps?
Well, I think, yeah, definitely it's something that, I don't know, the proverbial chicken or the egg, do people see things in there because it's shadowy and spooky, and, or by nature of these sort of remote and undeveloped areas, is that a place where, unknown creatures or, strange and, unknown phenomenon can exist and still exist. So I'm not sure, but I think it's probably a mixture of both. I'm sure, every shadow in the swamp is just a little more creepy and a little more perhaps monstrous than a shadow elsewhere.
Yeah. One of the first things you tackle in the book is the Bridgewater Triangle area.
Yeah, that's one that was, early on my radar, having Bridgewater Triangle, having Hockomock Swamp within its borders, and the Bridgewater Triangle at large, 200 square miles of identified strange activity of all sorts, and just sort of nestled in there is this swamp who which also has, a variety of tales from ghostly activity to, Bigfoot-like creatures, phantom cats, all sorts of things. And so it really worked good for the first chapter, because I felt it showcased a little bit of most everything that, we're going to encounter in these swamps as we go forward. And it's just, one of those that encompasses, I think, the best of the sinisterness and the spookiness that can be out there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a place I've heard a lot about, but I haven't really had anyone on to talk much about it. And where is it located exactly?
It's in Massachusetts. Okay. So it was the one that was farthest north, essentially, in my swampy travels, because you think about swamps, and they're everywhere, because swamps are just various types of drainage and overflowing and flooding rivers. But a lot of the swamps I cover are in the south, but this was a cool one because it was so far north in North America. So
one of the things that Bridgewater Triangle definitely has are like strange lights and stuff.
Right. And even, and I kind of had to separate what is within Bridgewater, but specifically what is in Hockomock itself.
Right.
And even in Hockomock, there were sightings of, strange lights and glowing orbs. There's a railroad track there that, people would see glowing orbs, things like that. So definitely, the strange lights and crafts and other things floating over that swampy area.
Yeah, and what did you feel about the swamp when you were there?
I guess all swamps are a bit ubiquitous in a way, but I think in my mind, each has a certain personality. And I think overall, and I think most people agree, that just Hockomock and Bridgewater, there's an air of a sinister air about that place. I don't know if that's governed by the fact that once you know the legends and you know what you're looking for, it kind of colors your thoughts. But not all swamps, I've been to seem sinister necessarily, just on the out, in general. So yeah, I think somewhat sinister.
Did you have anything weird happen while you were there?
No, I haven't. And this one, I relied on some other guys that had been up there, and some witnesses that had some really shocking instances. So this is one where I didn't, have a lot of personal input, as opposed to some of the others, especially in the South where I visited over and over. Those are the ones where maybe from frequency, things would tend to happen, or I may have some strange or spooky experience, but not there.
And this is one of the locations you get cryptids with red eyes.
Yeah, definitely. And some of the sightings, that's one of the things. You see a unknown creature, and if it's got red eyes, that it just adds to the eerie nature of the whole thing, on top of just seeing something like that in a spooky area. It's like, frightening experience on to scarier stuff,
What are some of the other cryptids that you found legend of there?
Let's see. Hockomock had sightings of some of the ones that went back a long time ago. People claim to see these really huge giant snakes. And you kind of naturally have that in swamps. They also had some sort of, I think it was like a phantom cat type thing, or a dog. It was something that was either canid or cat-like, that, was seen attacking and ripping the throat out of a horse in one instance, and the whole town sort of, went after it. This was back in the 70s, and animals would come up killed, and dogs were attacked, and horses, and they never could really find this thing. People theorized that it was just a feral dog or something, but just something that generated a lot of newspaper accounts. There was certainly the what I called Hockomock Harry. It was like a Bigfoot-like creature, and there was a lot of documented sightings. There was a researcher that did a lot of specifically Bigfoot research in there, and he had an encounter back in the 70s in there where he saw a hair-covered creature that ultimately fit the description of a Bigfoot. So you've got your Bigfoot presence, flying anomalies, people describing seeing winged creatures that resembled pterosaurs or pterodactyls, flying dinosaurs, featherless type creatures. So, and then probably the most spookiest, and I've already got some comments from readers who said this was a particularly nightmarish way I described this encounter, but a gentleman named Bill Russo encountered something that is called the Puck Wedgie, and it was something that is smaller, maybe 3 or 4 feet in height. It was hairy and kind of had a distended pot belly, and it was just the solitary figure he saw while walking his dog on the edge of the swampy area. And this thing seemed to be speaking, not necessarily in English, but it was over and over. It said, "E want to," and he surmised or theorized that it was saying, "We want you," or something like that. But just the encounter with this thing was super frightening and terrifying. And if you look back at the old Native American legends, and there's a lot of them there in Hockomock with the Native American presence, they described a creature called a Puck Wedgie that was sort of a trickster, or it could be a sinister entity that you had to beware of. And oddly enough, what Bill Russo described in Modern Times kind of fits that description of this thing that they talked about in Hockomock. So it kind of really brought it full circle of sort of the Native American legends, and then sightings in Modern Times of a creature that it's almost scarier, because we kind of understand, okay, there's Bigfoot sightings. We make some sense out of that. But this creature just sort of doesn't fit any category. It's just, and in the fact that it was talking makes him spooky.
Yeah. And I mean, and he didn't know that was a thing before, when he had that sighting.
Right. Yeah. That kind of raises the chill bumps, because he had never, until he ran into this thing and started doing some research, had never heard of the legend of the Puck Wedgie. So, the fact that what he was describing even fit that description, makes one wonder,
Yeah. I don't think I had heard of them until David Weatherly wrote about them.
Right. Yeah.
So that they're not something that is in common. I mean, now people are starting to know the name Puck Wedgie, but past the last few years, I don't think most people had ever heard of them.
Yeah, it's definitely not one that's known, far and wide. If you've studied Bridgewater Triangle, certainly it comes up in terms of that. But, and I have gotten random, sighting reports of a creature that's very similar, but not necessarily from Hockomock in out of that area, but still people describing it. But their encounters and descriptions of this creature seem quite rare. So I think that's why, it hasn't necessarily latched on, and it's not like a media blitz on Puck Wedgie. So it's one of those that sort of slowly builds the reputation of defining itself as a cryptid.
Yeah. It's definitely a weird one. You also talk about a weird UFO encounter in 1979 over the Rainham dog track.
Yeah, that was there's not a lot of UFO activity in swamps, but certainly as I wrote Sinister Swamps, I wanted to literally include anything that just was a startling or frightening report or legend. So this certainly fit that description. And this was I think that was 1979. And it was two radio reporters who were driving to this dog track out there, and they noticed kind of a bright light moving above the trees. And so it was enough to make them pull over to take a look. And they said that they had, as it came towards them, it got larger and larger, and it was as big as a football field and sort of, I don't know, shaped like a bit pointed like a baseball home plate. And it had reddish lights around it and maybe whitish lights and things like that. But it literally just moved right over their head and passed over. And I mean, it was huge. And they didn't say anything for a while because, these guys are radio reporters and you'd probably be worried about their reputation. But several other people had come forward saying they had seen it. So these guys decided to go public with it. And so, one of those that's an extremely credible UFO sighting and very hard to explain what that was unless it was some military vehicle. But if it was, it sure was flying low and uncaring as to who saw it because it was clearly visible. So those guys were what I consider two really credible witnesses.
Well, one of the things that you talk about in this chapter, but it comes up in other times in there, is that sense of overwhelming fear when people have some of these encounters, that sense to run, that panic in the woods type of thing, where they just go, And what do you think that comes from? Do you think it's as simple as they're just seeing something they can't explain, or do you think there's more to that?
Well, I think that, in some cases, it depends on who you're with or where you are and the circumstances. But surely I think that it's sort of a sudden realization that you're dealing with the unknown. You're not quite certain what you're looking at, whether it's a light or some kind of animal or an apparition. As humans, we tend to think, we're the apex predator. We're smarter than anyone and everything. But when you're sort of in that primal circumstance where it's all of a sudden you're confronted with the unknown, I think, your instincts kick in. And a lot of times that's going to be to, fight or flight. You're going to fight. You don't even know how to begin to fight because you can't define what it is you're looking at, especially if you have a clear view of even a Bigfoot. I've often said that, our idea of Bigfoot has become very like it's a fun-loving creature that eats beef jerky and the brunt of jokes. It's on lunch boxes and games. But if you actually saw a 7-foot tall, powerful ape-like creature in the woods that wasn't a gorilla or a chimpanzee or anything you've ever seen, suddenly, you would just realize that, man, I'm at a complete disadvantage. And I think running or whatever response would ensue. So especially, if something even more unknown, Puck Wedgie or what have you. So I think it's just something that's instinctual for us to flee when we feel in danger.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the Great Dismal. And where is this located?
Great Dismal kind of spans the border of North Carolina and Virginia.
Well, are there actually, would you say there's more swamps in the South than in the North? Well,
not necessarily more, but I think that a lot of times people associate the South with swamps, Savannah, Georgia, and Louisiana. A lot of these places are just known for swamps. And of course, drainage is pulling down through the Mississippi and towards the Gulf of Mexico. So drainage does build up as it comes south. But, of course, I didn't do any research to map out variety and how many swamps were in different places. But I did notice that in my research, in order to include it in the book, it had to be a swamp that had a significant amount of, strange activity, because, so it wouldn't just be haphazard. And most of the swamps here encompass a whole chapter. So I just noticed that the ones that were typically, as you move south, there were just more swamps that were just known for having so much activity. And so, but, Great Dismal Swamp is one that's sort of, moving further south and kind of somewhere between north and south. And of course, anything called the Great Dismal Swamp, I pretty much had put my money on the fact that this has got to have some creepy stuff in it, just given the name,
Yeah. What, and you talk a little bit about that later in the book, about like devil names and stuff. Do you think that's a significant thing to look for?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting and significant, because a lot of times even the translation of Native American names for these places would, in some ways reflect devil or sinister things, or deadly, in some terms. And so it wasn't just the invading settlers that had these feelings of associating these places with devils and things. Even the Native Americans did. And a lot of their legends would reflect what later reports, they'd have these legends of strange birds and creatures that supposedly lived in the swamp. And then in later times you would have, modern sort of cryptid reports. But certainly, again, it's like just the nature of the swamp just kind of inspires this, thoughts of ominous gloom and deviltry and witchcraft and whatever other things. And I think the naming of these swamps, even the Great Dismal, there's some of these are debatable as to who actually coined the name and why. But, many of the theories, have it that the original people that found this place would feel something strange or find a sinister aspect to it and give it a name such as Great Dismal Swamp.
The one of the interesting things in there is Lake Drummond, which you say is almost exactly circular.
Yeah, it's a near circular body of water, and it's pretty much in the center of the swamp. And that it kind of encompasses quite a bit of activity there. And at one time they had, people had seen spirits canoeing across the lake. And then later, when there was a hotel built there at one point, and, residents or visitors, the hotel would see ghostly images out there. And, dating back to the Native Americans, they kind of incorporated that into their legends. And of course, you have this swamp and here's this circular lake in the middle. I'm sure just geographically it inspired them to try to explain why that was there and incorporate that into their stories.
And one of the things that this place seems to have a lot of is ghost stories.
Yeah, I think it might actually have a lot of more ghost content than others. And it was cool to write about this because, most of my books, as have dealt mostly with cryptozoology and cryptids and monster type things. So I've always been interested in ghostly activity and things. And this was a way sort of like ghosts in the woods. This is awesome, because, I could really set a mood to the swamp when people are describing not only unknown creatures, but ghostly figures. And Great Dismal has, quite a bit of it.
The one that I found really interesting was the legend of the vanishing graveyard.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually, David Weatherly was the first to mention that to me when I was discussing, my thoughts about writing a book about swamps. He's like, oh man, because he used to live in that area close to Great Dismal. He's like, you got to check out, look into the Vanishing Graveyard. I'm like, oh, that sounds cool, And so what that amounts to is that at some point, many years ago, there was a worker who was living near there, and he was going through an area and came upon this old, what looked like a little small family graveyard. And he thought it was interesting because it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And he thought, well, this is neat. I'm going to show it to my wife. So he went and got his wife and came back, and the thing was gone. And he thought that was odd, and he thought, well, maybe I got turned around. But according to the story, he was certain that he came back to the location and it wasn't there anymore. And then, he wasn't the only person to sort of report this vanishing graveyard. There were other reports that people would see, come upon graveyards that would disappear, fade in front of their eyes, or that they would find, and then later they would come back and it would be gone. So I thought that was kind of unique, because normally you kind of think of ghosts themselves as kind of vanishing and coming and going and disappearing. But this literally was a small graveyard itself. So pretty cool.
Wasn't there a story where someone was like looking at it and they turned around and it was gone or something?
Yeah, I think that was it in one case, and then some of these stories are very, it's not a person I interviewed, unfortunately.
Right.
But I think in some cases, it was like literally they would turn around and it was, it just had vanished.
Now, David Weatherly had a bit of a experience up there too, didn't he?
Yeah, that was one thing I definitely wanted to include, especially because he and several buddies had been hiking through there. I think they were looking for a rumored witch's lair or something, and they were trying to get out of there after dark, and saw what at first they took to be a large tree, and then the thing moved, and they realized it was a large hairy creature, obviously, fitting a Bigfoot type description. So quite startling, and one of the what's one of the stories when David's told me some of these cool experiences he's had. This one's one of the ones that stood out to me quite a bit. So it worked perfectly into my book, obviously, because I prefer when I can interview a person myself. Then I have something to some credibility to it, rather than just sort of, well, my buddy once, his grandmother's grandmother's grandmother once saw whatever. Yeah. Those are cool legends, and legends are certainly part of it. But it also rounds it out when you have especially a credible person that I know in real life that had seen something there himself.
Yeah, and witches are another thing that are seem unusual in some of these.
Yeah, Great Dismal, I kept seeing, in articles, people would mention, there's, the swamp is home to witches and things. And sometimes it's a challenge to research, because you realize that basically when I try to use first person, I try to go to the places when I can, and I research newspapers, but sometimes you're just pinging around on the internet, and you begin to notice that there's a blog, which mentions that there's witches, and then you realize that there's all the other blogs have pretty much copied that, and it's the same. It came from one source, but nobody really ever says, what is the story? Okay, you say witches, give me an instance. So I really had to dig around to find some actual stories, and I did. There was a historian that had documented some of these that had been spoken about. And these witches' tales range from going back to Native Americans of just sort of playfulness, like women who were witches and they could turn into deer and they would run into the woods and try to get hunters to chase them and would lead them, astray and try to get them lost and that sort of thing, all the way to tales of there was a couple who was taking up residence deep in the swamp, and the husband got ill and died of some strange circumstances, and his corpse had this odd kind of fearful look stamped upon his face. And then afterwards, the woman, the widow, became a hermit, and then she became her hair turned gray and she became witch-like, and then things started happening to the neighbors, and they noticed this strange cat-like creature that was creeping around just as one woman died, and they chased the cat back, and it came to the cottage of this old woman. And obviously back in some certain times ago, they assumed she possessed the devil's witchery and actually tried to burn her at the stake. And then other tales of witches trying to poison individuals with the purpose of supposedly to eat them. And so there was not just witches, there was cannibal witches. So I'm like, I don't know, man, the Dismal Swamp just doesn't sound like that's, and that was one that I have not actually been to. And I was like, maybe I just don't need to go there.
You also have, you talk about the witches leading people off. You talk also about the swamp, like many of them, having foxfire, will-o-wisps, the sort of anomalous lights. And that seems to be very common in swamps. And of course, people will say it's just swamp gas.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the, standard explanations as to why people see glowing orbs in the swamp and ghostly figures. And certainly, I mean, that's a real phenomenon. Fairy fire, will-o'-the-wisps, things like that. It's a result of fungus putting off this sort of bioluminescence, and it's a natural occurrence. And, that would obviously, if you saw something like that sort of in this swamp where conceivably nobody should be, it would look like a light or an orb or something strange. So I'm sure that accounts for some of these legends, but certainly doesn't account for it all, and certainly doesn't explain, say, a Bigfoot-like creature or something like that. So, and I didn't, in the book, I tried not to get too science-y or bogged down in, there's just so much phenomenon I'm talking about and so many legends, so much that I just sort of weave back and forth from just the things that are reported and going on, and then mention maybe in passing what people may have said it could be. But, I try not to get too bogged down in explanations or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these things sound like plasma more than just like glowing fungus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a glowing fungus is, and usually that doesn't move. I mean, it can maybe appear to move if you yourself are moving toward it. Things do get turned around in the swamp, but not so much what people described as especially ghostly apparitions or plasma type. Definitely just doesn't seem as though foxfire or swamp gas could explain all of that.
Yeah. And the other thing is when people mention witches, like there's a graveyard here in the middle of nowhere that people kept telling me to go check out because it has the grave of a witch. And I'm like, what does that even mean? And no one could really give me any more information. That was just the legend of it. It has the grave of a witch. And I'm like, so like a modern witch? Like, was it just an old woman that kept to herself? Like, what's the story,
Yeah. Yeah, that's because it sounds super cool. Like, ooh, a grave of a witch. Got to go look at this. But yeah, if you kind of go to the next step is, well, witch, what did she do? And then there's never well, I don't know. It's just a grave of a witch, So
I will say it is a spooky graveyard. I didn't get a lot of chance to explore it because it was getting very dark, and but it was one of those things where there was absolute silence, and you're in the middle of nowhere down some dirt roads, and I'm like, okay, I can see why this creeps people out.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like, in many ways, like a swamp. If you're out in a graveyard, especially the rural types where they're out in the woods and they're not very big and they're a bit overgrown, there is just something, ominous and spooky about those places. And for sure there's dead people under that ground. So, and possibly dead witches. So you never know.
Let's move on to Honey Island. There were a few things here I thought were really interesting. I mean, first of all, there's the Honey Island swamp monster, which seems to be partially like an aquatic Bigfoot.
Yeah, it kind of gets lumped in occasionally with the Bigfoot category, but it's definitely not. I mean, the description of it is it can walk upright on two legs and it's covered in hair, but its alleged footprint does not look, like a five-toed Bigfoot print. And some of the witnesses, at least Harlan Ford, it kind of, I don't know, had a Dogman vibe to me, or a Rougarou type thing. But it's kind of a unique thing unto itself. It's almost like it's got that Boggy Creek Monster kind of category, to where it just, because of its name, the Honey Island Swamp Monster, it just sort of stands alone as just some unknown creature that, has lived in these woods for years and years. And Honey Island Swamp is, for those that don't know, it's in very southern Louisiana, about 45 minutes east of New Orleans. So it's in the heart of Cajun country, right down there on the swampy Gulf Coast, where, I mean, it is swampy and lots of river systems and boggy woods in that area.
The three-toed webbed feet is definitely a weird description.
Yeah, and and I won't give spoilers, but I do discuss that footprint track, and it's kind of a famous thing that was taken and supposedly found in 1974 by Harlan Ford, whom had a sighting of the creature back in 1963. But it is one of those that's not necessarily proof of the creature, if you will, and certainly it doesn't add up biologically. I mean, you're talking about the footprint is like this kind of webbed three-toe with a dew claw type thing, almost alligator-like. And that just doesn't fit the footprint of, an upright bipedal hairy creature, which, if it has any ape-like qualities, would typically have 5 toes, although southern monsters seem to always have 3 toes, and there's no real anatomical explanation for that. But yeah, it was one of those that was, nobody. It wasn't like the creature was seen and then those footprints were found. It were just footprints found. So they could have been from something else. They could have been could have been fake.
Yeah. Yeah. There's also an 8mm film you talk about.
Yeah, that's another thing that almost kind of doesn't jive with the original descriptions, but Harlan Ford, allegedly, they found this 8mm film in his stuff after he had passed away, and it shows this sort of a Bigfoot-like creature that walks through the trees. It looks like they were filming from a tree stand, possibly like a hunting tree stand, but it's this dark Bigfoot-like figure, and it looks very Bigfoot. I mean, not as clear and pronounced as the Patterson-Gimlin film, but not a bad film. And it's one of those that people have tried to decide, is it a person? Is it a animal? Is it a hoax? What could it be? And Harlan Ford's not here to answer anymore. So his daughter, Dana Holyfield, has kind of taken up the research on the Honey Island swamp monster and is most associated with that creature. But the debate about that film just still kind of goes on.
Did he release the film, or did his daughter release the film?
His wife, if I recall right, he was passed away before the film was found.
Okay.
He never released it, and I think it was Dana that actually showed it for the first time. But Harlan Ford's wife, I think, found it in going through his stuff. Now, why he never put it out there is one of the unanswered questions.
Yeah. Is it available on, like, can people see it if they look it up?
I think if you Google it, you should be able to see it. Honey Island Swamp Monster film or something like that. I'm sure it's on YouTube. I can't recall right off the bat. I've seen it so many times. It's just sort of like, it's like the Patterson film. It just lives in my brain. But yeah, I'm pretty sure you can definitely, and it's been featured on several TV shows, over the years where people have analyzed it and things like that.
It looks like there's a documentary out by on this as well.
Yeah, and Dana has produced some documentaries, which are definitely good companions to the book. I kind of cover the gist of the entire history, and I have some witnesses in mind that haven't had their stories published before. But Dana, who lives there, has a multitude of people she's interviewed, obviously, and a good cross-section of people who describe their encounters.
So for two of these swamps in the book, I don't know how to say this properly, Okefenokee?
Yeah, Okefenokee.
And the Everglades, you talk about either of these locations could be where Flight 19 that disappeared into the Bermuda Triangle ended up.
Yeah, that was kind of a treat to find, the theories that had, this famous flight had disappeared actually in a swamp. And theories in both of those cases were that the guys had turned inland and didn't realize it, and it got dark, and they were still unsure where they were or what they were flying over. And it's complicated, but when you read the book, you can see how there's documented possibilities that Flight 19 could have come inland and either crashed in Okefenokee or the Everglades. And if they did, certainly the Everglades in Florida is huge. And if they crashed out there, it'd be hard to find. Okefenokee as well. I went to that one, and it's huge. And when you start rowing a canoe out there, you just realize, like, man, I was with my research partner, Cindy Lee, and I'm thinking, if we just tumped over the canoe or something and an alligator ate us, I don't think anybody would ever find us. There's just no way. It's just huge, and so much brackish black water and peat moss and miles upon miles. So if those guys crashed those planes in there, unless you knew where to look, and you just wouldn't find them.
Yeah, and didn't you say one plane was found in the Everglades, but it wasn't verified?
Right. They did actually find a Avenger torpedo plane in there and pulled it up, and they were trying to compare it to see if it was one of the guys from Flight 19. And of course, it had been submerged in water, and the markings on it had been faded and this and that. And they weren't quite sure, but later investigators had seen pictures of it, and they felt that it was the same type of Avenger torpedo plane that was involved with Flight 19. And unfortunately, the wreckage, as in a lot of these cases, it went missing.
Of course.
Whether it just sunk back into the Everglades and they never pulled it out, or there was some newspaper coverage when they had found that plane, and people feel like that possibly people went down there and just, pilfered the parts. And so it's no way to verify it now because the parts are gone.
Yeah. Yeah. And with today's technology, even if the marks faded, we might have been able to get the information we needed.
Yeah, probably so. I think that's with all these. A lot of times, if you still have the evidence to evaluate later with better technology, perhaps the answers would become clear. And so, unfortunately, even with, murder, cold cases and things like that, if the evidence ends up getting lost, then, it doesn't matter. We'll never know the answer. And obviously, we'll never know the answer of Flight 19 because with so many theories of Bermuda Triangle and just crashing into the ocean or into a swamp, it's fascinated us all this time, but I don't think we'll ever be able to really prove it unless somebody stumbles upon one of the planes for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the interesting things you talk about in Okefenokee is the giant skeletons they found.
Yeah, there's a lot of Native American mounds in there in Okefenokee, and Okefenokee is located in Georgia. For those that would like to place that geographically, and yeah, there's some in much of these areas. There's these Indian mounds and things like that, and burials and unearthing skeletons, and supposedly they found these skeletons there that are, very, very large, very tall, and do not appear to be normal humans. And, that whole skeleton debate enters into the Bigfoot type thing. Are they Bigfoots? Are they a race of giants that once lived, upon the continent? There's some intriguing stuff, but thus far, no proof. But certainly a place like Okefenokee, there's a lot of strange things, and including finding these giant skeletons.
Yeah, the giant skeleton thing always fascinates me, as well as Native American legends of giants and stuff. One of the cryptid, the Bigfoot-like creature, is called Man Mountain there, correct?
Right. Yeah, that's a tale that goes back many years that was back in 1829, I believe, which is one of the oldest sort of Bigfoot-esque stories that we find, that was documented in a newspaper at the time. And the hulking ape-like creature was called the Man Mountain. And that was sort of what people called it and referred to it, I guess, in that area. But back in 1829, there was a couple of guys had gone back in there, and they found these huge footprints, and they came out and they were describing what they had seen. And some hunters thought, wow, what could this thing be? And so they trekked off back in there looking for it, and ended up being confronted by these huge ape-like creatures. And they ended up, shooting one, and they never came out with a specimen, and it was just purely a story. But allegedly, back in the Okefenokee lived, these huge, what we would call Bigfoot in modern terms and descriptions. But at the time, just they didn't know, they would just create a name such as Man Mountain, and that's what they called it.
And this is the one they killed.
Yeah, I believe they were sitting at their camp, and one of these beasts rushed out, and they all shot at it, and they killed it. But I think so there was multiple creatures, so they just had to escape with their lives. They couldn't, bring it out of the swamp. And it was also huge,
right.
It's hard enough to trek back in there just on your own, much less to haul some heavy carcass out of there. But I mean, they could have taken a hand or something, but they just couldn't pull it off, so that it remains an unsolved mystery, a legend.
You talk about there's so much different stuff in this book. I really love it. You talk about a sea monster in Altamaha.
Yeah, Altamaha, I guess would be the way you say it. But that's actually a river, the Altamaha River, that flows through eastern Georgia and empties out into the Atlantic near Darien and Brunswick areas. And swamps, and I kind of give a rundown of just types of swamps, but this is one of those where the swamp is created by basically the floodplains of a river. So while it is the Altamaha River, it's very, very swampy in that you've got these flooded bogs and estuaries that begin to play in as it empties out into the Atlantic. And over the years in Altamaha River, and especially along the coast, people have reported seeing a creature not unlike the Loch Ness Monster, but this long snake-like humped creature that swims up and down the river and into the side offshoots of it. And the creature is known as the Altamaha, or Alti for short. So it's sort of I guess it's like I wouldn't say it's America's Loch Ness Monster, because that would be Champ in Lake Champlain, but this is sort of like Nessie's river cousin that lives sort of in a swampy seaside area.
In the Everglades section, you talk about a ghost village, which was a Native American village that was just mysteriously abandoned. Right.
Yeah. I came across stories like that where, they would, archaeologists or researchers or hikers even would come across things like that, lost villages, and they had just been abandoned and nobody really knew why. And just sort of as I don't know there's any sinister or any strange thing about it, other than it's always kind of leaves you with that feeling of what happened when you come across any sort of village that's been abandoned, any town, a ghost town. It's almost like a swamp ghost town, or, we always have that sort of lingering question and want to know, why did the people leave? This is a good area, and things like that. So, again, it just attests for how big some of these swamps are, especially Everglades and places like that, because you literally, you had communities or villages that existed back in those swamps. People lived in there, and there was just a dot on the map, really.
You talk about some of the strange disappearances too that have happened around the Everglades, and I mean, obviously these swamps are so big that it would be easy for someone to get lost, but there are cases where these people shouldn't have gotten lost.
Yeah, I think certainly it's. You're right. I mean, a swamp is a place where people are darn well likely to get lost. So it's not totally unbelievable that somebody could get lost in there. But some of the cases were people who, knew where they were going. They were, not inexperienced. They were hunters, things like that seemingly just disappeared. And, nobody could find them, even after, some significant search and rescue trying to, locate these people. And so, again, that just kind of gives these swamps another air of ominous spookiness, as, you could potentially just disappear into these by whatever means, whether it's simply turning the wrong way, getting turned around, or one of these creatures, these unknown creatures, or a known creature, even a snake, could take you out. Or, as I always worried about when I was young, quicksand. I'd watch those old movies. I thought, And I see there's like a meme now that's like, I really thought this would be a problem later in life. I think some of us as kids, just definitely thought, dude, quicksand, man, I was scared of it,
Right. Well, it was such a trope in old, like, 70s TV shows and movies. Yeah.
It was always they always went down and the one right hand was still sticking up, and it slowly went under. And I'm like, man, these swamps, I could just step in quicksand in any second. But thus far, I've been pretty lucky.
How serious is the quicksand problem in reality?
Well, I don't think it's that much of a problem. I mean, I'm always trying to hunt down reports of people getting sucked in and dying in quicksand, but I just can never get them. Bigfoot reports all the time, but however, though, the only report I actually got was when I was doing research for my Lizard Man book and the Bishopville Lizard Man in South Carolina, and I was talking to the retired Sheriff Liston Truesdale, who was involved in that case, and he was talking about Skateboard Swamp. And he told me he was actually trying to chase a moonshiner in there once, and he fell into quicksand, and he was sinking down, but he was able to free himself. It wasn't sort of that giant pool of
doom,
oatmeal looking grits thing, that we see on TV. But he did get out. But I was like, man, you actually fell in quicksand? He's like, yep.
I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons, especially in this tough time. Your donations mean a lot. You are literally keeping this show going. So thank you so much. And an extra special thanks to those pledging $10 or more. Super Inframan, Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, Tim, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Joanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Trewell, The Great Change, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Chris Barr, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Demian Tallman, Edu Camahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Maria, Sam Sharon, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, J. Otto Bullitt, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris 646, Carla Mahoney, and James Lattimore. Thank you all so very much. What's interesting to me, and this happens in a number of cases in these books, is that someone will see something odd, like a Bigfoot creature or whatever, and then it'll disappear or they'll run away or whatever, but then they see it again short time after that. And it seems to me like the odds of that happening are like astronomical. I'm not saying I don't believe them. I'm saying I find it an odd thing that you see over and over again.
Yeah, certainly so. I mean, I really have to look at those with a skeptical eye, because, as much as we may think, from Facebook that every time you go in the woods, you see a Bigfoot, it's really not the case. That would truly be a rare experience. So for somebody to even see one twice, I think would be tough. Although in some cases, I think if you lived in the right place and you had lived there your entire life, I mean, it's not out of the question, I suppose, that you could, have two sightings or something like that. And, who am I to say? I just sort of, I do my best to vet witnesses and things, but in some cases, yeah, there's some, and there's one I believe there's one I cover in the book here where a gentleman, but in this case, I've known the guy for years, and I trust that his sightings are believable, but had seen something in the same general area on two occasions. And but I've been to that area, and I'm telling you, if there's Bigfoots, that's where they exist. So who knows? Who knows?
I guess my way of looking at it is that there's something about the phenomena that once someone notices it, I mean, kind of like UFOs. I mean, people will have other stuff follow them after UFO encounters. You know, like, are we somehow drawing this stuff's attention by noticing it the first time?
Yeah, that's true. And I try, as I've done research over the years, I've kind of tried to keep my mind open about that because, and some people have mentioned this, it's like perhaps a person has an affinity to see things that others don't, or is like a magnet or an attraction for strange phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And while that might sound like, how could that be? You never know. And so it could explain why some people, could look all their life and never see anything, and why somebody else could have 2 or 3 dramatic experiences. I don't know, but, it's hard to say what the reasoning is, but it's not out of the question that somebody could be an attraction for strange phenomenon.
Yeah, that would be me. Although I've never seen a cryptid of any kind.
Yeah.
I've had plenty of strange things, though. And I think some of it does come down to some people are more open to it than others. Just like some people can see more colors than other people can. There's a spectrum there.
Yeah, and that's very well can be true. And I think, even just being open to it, like, I think, there's probably been times when, a hunter or somebody has been in the woods and possibly seen a Bigfoot or a glimpse of it. But if he, just sort of does not have that in his capacity to even consider, then he's going to explain it away with something else. So
yeah,
you got to be open to it. And, but I've actually personally, I've not seen a cryptid. I mean, I've had things happen, and I believe that I might have been close on a couple of occasions, and things have happened in the woods, but I've never definitively looked and said, yep, that's definitely a cryptid. But when I was younger, I did actually see a ghost. So that experience, for me, I'm like, and I never doubted that people see something that we define as ghosts. And so having seen that myself, I'm like, I don't know if that was a dead person or how you explain it, but I saw a whitish figure that, we would define as a ghost.
Now you got to tell the story.
Yeah. This was happened when I was a senior in high school, and one of my friends lived in a house, not far away. And he had talked several times about having seen a ghost in his house. And not only he, but his parents had seen it, and several of my friends had mentioned seeing it. So I thought it was cool, and I kind of, I don't remember. I wasn't of the investigative sort, so I didn't nowadays I would have taken notes and had them all give me their sighting, but I just remember just generally knowing that they had seen a ghost in there. And so on one evening, I was at his house. I was sitting in the front room on the fireplace, kind of watching the TV, waiting for him to get ready because we were going to go out. And it sort of faced the entrance to the house, and just out of the corner of my eye, all of a sudden I see this, sort of whitish figure catch my attention, and I just turned and looked. And for just a brief moment, I saw what looked like the figure of a youth of some sort walk by right from the den towards the hallway where their bedrooms were. And I just immediately go, man, I saw the ghost. And he's like, and my friend was just very nonchalant about the whole thing. He's like, yep, well, that's where we see it. He was just like an everyday thing to him, no big deal. But he supposedly the story was that there had been a boy who lived in that house. I guess had passed away or something, but it was a boy. And what I saw was certainly fit the figure of a boy. It wasn't well defined, and it was whitish and apparition-like. But I can kind of picture it now, even though it's been all these years. But definitely, and I kind of looked. I was like, kind of got up and looked as to, was it a trick of light? What did I just see? And I couldn't find any explanation as to what that was. It wasn't a reflection from the TV or anything like that. And it's not like on a busy road, no headlights coming in the windows or anything like that. I could never make sense other than whatever I saw was what people would consider a ghost.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my approach to this stuff at this point is that these things, whether they be cryptids, goats, lights in the sky, whatever, all this stuff has been with us throughout written history and probably before. We may name it different things. We may, have different things attached to it, but the phenomena itself exist. It's just a matter of we don't quite understand what they are.
Right. Yeah, that is, it boils down to that. I mean, if I talk to skeptics or people like you do you believe in Bigfoot? You look into Bigfoot or whatever they ask me, I can usually convince them and say, look, people have reported seeing something we can't explain. I have no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. We don't. The question is what is it?
Yes.
You can't say that people don't see these things. It's just that we don't have the answer, whether it's a ghost or a cryptid or an extraterrestrial or anything. It is a phenomenon that's not a hallucination. It is not people making this up or lying or hoaxing. Certainly there's probably some of that, but that doesn't explain the massive amounts of sightings we've logged over the years.
Right. And again, going right back into like Native American culture and stuff like that when it comes to like Bigfoot. And some of this other stuff as well.
Right. Yeah. If you look at their legends, and they're eerily similar, and they describe it in different terms, and maybe I think in a lot of times they embellished, they took that spark and would embellish stories out of it, because that's what they did. I mean, that was their pastime in a way. I mean, they didn't have TV and all this other stuff. They would, if you saw a strange bird fly by that you didn't know what it was, suddenly it's, you've created a backstory and things like that. So I think they were definitely seeing the same things as we're reporting today, and just trying to make sense of it in the world.
Yeah, different mask on it.
Right.
It's also like you're talking about in one case, the Green Swamp Dog Killer, which was this supposed cryptid that killed a bunch of dogs in really horrible ways.
Yeah, the Beast of Bladenboro. That's one I've kind of been wanting to write about for a while, but it's a case from the 1950s, and it just not enough to it for a complete book or anything. Right. But being that it occurred near Big Green Swamp and / Big Swamp in North Carolina, I could finally sort of run this down. But it was a case of this sort of nightmarish type of a dog or canine, a feline creature that was, taking out all the dogs and frightening the residents in and around this area. The law officials, and they got posses together and hunted this thing down, and it was a thing going on for about a year. A lot of newspaper reports on this one, which are great because you've got a lot of documentation to piece together the story. And one that ended up, I think it was some kind of cat. They eventually, a hunter killed a bobcat, and that's supposedly, we killed the Beast of Bladenboro, but it definitely wasn't a bobcat, and that's not what people described. This thing ran up in the yard of a woman, and they saw it clear as day right there, and it wasn't a normal feline that they could identify. So it was one of those kind of interesting cases, and the headlines in the newspapers would call it the vampire beast and all this other stuff, and
that's because some of the animals had all the blood drained, right?
Right, yeah, that they would be bloodless, kind of a feline, kind of a cat-like chupacabra almost, very, very much kind of falls in line with what you would later see with chupacabra. Although there's legends like that in many places where vampire type beasts come up in legend and lore, and anytime somebody finds these livestock or pets that are drained of blood, it's pretty frightening.
What I find interesting about that, though, is when things like this happen, and I mean, it happens with cryptids in general, just like it happens with UFOs and stuff, where you have this flap where these things will happen and then they'll just stop. And then maybe 30 years later, you have another flap of it. And it's like, where's the phenomena going in that time period?
Yeah, that is always a big question. I mean, and you see that in a lot of cases. This case, the Beast of Bladenboro case, and when I was talking about the Lizard Man, that was very concentrated in 1988, and it was just sort of like there for a few years and gone. And I don't know how to explain that. I mean, I'm certain that once people became, one thing is that people become alerted to it, they're looking for it. And the newspapers are hot on the trail, so they're willing to report the stuff. Well, after a while, if the newspapers, something big happens in politics or what have you, and their attention goes somewhere else, perhaps there's a pandemic, and then suddenly we need to protest. How you can see how the media just goes somewhere else, and
right.
And I think that's the case here, where if the newspaper isn't reporting it anymore, it's almost like, well, it disappeared. But I'm sure that you would have lingering sightings. It's just that they just didn't get on the record, and unless there was some researcher or somebody who was kind of fielding the reports, then perhaps it didn't just totally dry up. It just sort of people became disinterested and moved on to something else because there was no explanation.
Do you think that some of these areas are more like, I always look at the environmental factor. Like, is it possible that, for instance, swamps or just being out in nature in general, getting away from all the electromagnetic fields of society and stuff, may heighten our ability to actually experience this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, because certainly without the interference and the distractions of, our urban environments and all of that, when you get out into nature and you sort of simplify yourself, you notice things that you wouldn't normally notice. And I think that could be one thing. If you're in a swamp, you're alert and noticing the world around you in a different way than if you're on a street corner in a busy city.
Well, I also wonder, when we're dealing with things like the anomalous lights and stuff, if you look at like Earth lights theories of people like Paul Devereaux and such, I mean, it might be that some of these areas also affect our consciousness in a way that opens us up to other things that we wouldn't normally be able to see under different circumstances.
Yeah, certainly so. I mean, there's any number of theories as to, why some certain area would have a quantity of phenomenon, and it could very well be that area, or that area has some way to open up our minds or make us see a different perspective or something like that. And I think that's all of those, there's just so many good angles to look at it from that we strive to sort of find the right answer, but perhaps it's one that is yet beyond science or beyond us to grasp at the moment.
One of the other stories I liked in here was from the Bear Creek Bog, which is one of the ones you just give a smaller entry in a chapter with a bunch of smaller entries in it that talks about a missing car.
Yeah, that was cool. Yeah, there was some swamps that I include in that last chapter, more menacing mire, that they were good ones, but they just didn't encompass a lot of stuff. But Bear Creek Swamp in Alabama was one that had some really weird and spooky stuff, and that included this phantom car. And there was several reports of people seeing these cars driving towards them, careening towards them, and it would just drive by and seemingly disappear. And that was kind of unique in terms of ghostly phenomenon, I guess. And
didn't they film it at one point, and it wasn't on the film, like they saw it and they had a camera running or something?
Yeah, that was actually a friend of mine who was out there and setting up, and it went by and thought he got it on video. So that was one of those cases where he's a researcher, so he had the wherewithal to have some equipment out there rather than just sort of walking around. But he attested to this, and that's a person I know. So sometimes, again, you have these stories where they're just sort of these amorphous, uncredited stories that lurk around, but then you find a witness or somebody who says, no, I was out there and I saw that. Interesting.
And also for that same place, you had a urban legend of the grieving mother.
Yeah, I like that one too.
Yeah.
I was like, man, this place has just got really weird stuff. But yeah, it was a legend of this ghostly mother who I believe had lost her baby. And it's kind of one of those urban legends almost, though. It's like if you go out there and say, we have your baby 3 times, she'll emerge from the shadows and attack, which just sounds like okay, that's an urban legend. But there was a guy who claims that they were out there hanging out and drinking and stuff, and that they were goofing around and did just that and tempted this ghostly mother. And one of the guys ended up, his leg got cut, and that this whole thing happened, and they got scared and jumped in the car and drove off. And then he was in pain. I mean, they saw his leg bleeding, and but eventually, all of a sudden, the cut and everything else was just gone, and they just couldn't explain it. But whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it certainly made for this swamp having some really creepy stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't discount the stone tape theory idea for some of these encounters, like the car, where you might be in an environment that's actually somehow recording something that was very emotional, and it plays back occasionally to certain people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always kind of thought about that sort of thing, where it's like just this, like a repeating loop of some tragedy or something or something that happened, where a glimpse of it bleeds through. And I don't know, it's really interesting and cool. I mean, I've always thought of that especially in terms of seeing something like a car, which is a mechanical. This isn't it's not a spirit. There was no, it had no soul or spirit or anything else to pass on. So if people are seeing that, it has to be some sort of a playback type thing.
So the last one I'm going to bring up that you have in this book is probably not supernatural at all, but it's damn creepy. You're talking, and I don't remember which swamp it is, but you're talking about how some guy's driving down the road and he looks to the side and he sees a bunch of doll heads on bamboo stakes.
Well, believe it or not, that's Bear Creek Swamp as well. Okay. Yeah, they really capped that off with these creepy dolls, and that was, I mean, this made it in USA Today. If you Google Bear Creek Alabama dolls or whatever, it comes up. But yeah, some police officer driving by there had seen these doll heads on stakes out there in the swamp, kind of in a place where you couldn't really, it wasn't just on the side of the road or anything. You had to get out there with a canoe to even get to them, so you could see them. And, I'm sure it just was a prank or whatever else, just meant to get attention, but it was nonetheless very creepy, and especially finding those in a swamp that has a history of really creepy stuff.
Yeah.
And so finally the authorities literally had to go out there and take them down because, people were just totally disturbed by this whole thing. But, this made it USA Today. I'm like, well, that's big news right there. This little old swamp in Alabama.
And maybe it was a prank. It's definitely, if it was a prank, because they were all like antique dolls too.
Yeah, they were kind of painted on. And dolls are just creepy anyway.
Yeah.
They're just something. And I think that's because it's like, they're human. They're basically infant human in some way. And you kind of look at them. Do they have any sort of, are they alive and stuff? So just to see these kind of just creepy heads out there in the swamp, it freaked people out.
I bet. Anyway, the book is Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire. You're Lyle Blackburn, I believe. And this is available everywhere?
Everywhere where finer books are sold, such as Amazon and my website at lyleblackburn.com.
All right. Do you have anything coming up? Any virtual stuff coming up or anything?
Well, yeah, it's been a strange year. So, I had a lot of speaking events and really good stuff lined up, but all of them are canceled. However, there's one that still stands on July 25th. They're doing the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And I guess I'm going to see how that goes, but that's a big conference out there that draws a big crowd. So we'll see how it goes. They've got it all figured out how to do it safely. So I guess I'm going to go for that. But other than that, yeah, a lot of stuff has really been, up in upheaval this year. But I'll probably do some. I've been thinking about doing some virtual presentations online, kind of like what I would do at a conference where I just, maybe talk about a case, or maybe I can put one together for Sinister Swamps. But so, yeah, just, if people follow me on my Facebook page and check out my website, there's all kinds of good news there. And we also have I'm associated with the Small Town Monsters documentary films. I narrate a lot of those films. And I just completed narration for a new one called The Mothman Legacy, which is going to is sort of a follow-up to our Mothman of Point Pleasant documentary we did several years ago. So that will be coming out very soon.
Cool. All right. I know a lot of conferences are actually just doing everything virtual at this point. The Newkirks did one like that. Apparently went quite well.
Yeah. I think, people are kind of attuned to, getting what they can. And we actually did there's a Lizard Man festival that happens every year or two. And they did the virtual thing with that. So yeah, I got on Facebook Live and did my presentation. It was weird though, because I'm live, but usually I'm speaking to an audience, and it's sort of, you get some feedback, but it went pretty well, and people were like, man, you got to do more of these. So I was like, that'd be cool. So,
we're lucky, despite everything that's going on, we're lucky to have the technology and the connectiveness that we have today.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't imagine. Could you just imagine if we were in lockdown and, without the internet and all this stuff, that would be very stressful.
And more so than it already is.
Yeah, than it already is.
Thank you so much for spending time with us, Lyle.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons. And we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.